All right, my friends, welcome once again to the Bailey Report. This is part two of the last broadcast that we did, which was episode number 6. And as we do a deep dive into the indictment issued against one Donald J. Trump in the United States District Court for the District of Columbia. We initially, in part 1, went through some of the definitions, and I gave you an example of, in layman's terms, of the definition of indictment, the definition of grand jury, how the process works. We likewise took a look at the first part of this indictment, the introduction of the indictment. And as I told you then, this indictment is, I spent almost 30 years in criminal defense work and practicing in several states. And I must tell you, as I said before, that this indictment happens to be one of the best and most well-written indictments that I have ever read. I believe that Jack Smith, the special prosecutor appointed in this matter by the United States Attorney General, is brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. In fact, the way he laid this indictment out, I will be utterly surprised if there is not a guilty verdict on at least one of the 4 counts that Donald Trump finds himself charged with. Now, by way of review, let's go back over a couple of things. Number one, this is a federal indictment. That means it is brought by the United States, not by any particular state. That means that it's held in federal court. Donald J. Trump, the style of the case, that's what we call it, the style of the case, is United States of America versus Donald J. Trump. That means that Jack Smith represents who? You and I. Every citizen of this country, every taxpayer in this country. You and I, the people of the United States of America versus Donald J. Trump. He's charged with conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, obstruction of an attempt to obstruct an official proceeding, and conspiracy against the rights of the voters. That means, once again, you and I. So the indictment was brought by a grand jury. The grand jury meets in secret, and this was an investigative grand jury. That means that they did a deep look into the evidence, and what they searched for is what we call probable cause. That is it probable that Donald J. Trump operated within this conspiracy to commit these crimes? Now, in order to have a conspiracy, as I told you in part 1, you must have more than one person. There must be co-conspirators. However, and this is very important for you to remember, the co-conspirators do not have to be indicted. The first time we saw this was in the Watergate conspiracy with Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was an unindicted co-conspirator with Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and John Mitchell. His two special counsels, 2 special assistants, and the Attorney General of the United States, along with his special counsel, Attorney John Dean, and several other people. Well, in this indictment, there are 6 co-conspirators. In part 1, I told you that co-conspirator number 1 is Rudy Giuliani, Attorney Rudy Giuliani. In conspiracy number 2, co-conspirator number 2 is Attorney John Eastman. In co-conspirator number 3 in this indictment is Attorney Sidney Powell, that kooky lady that believes that there are some space rays coming from satellites that change the votes over. Co-conspirator number 4 is Attorney Jeffrey Clark, who went to Donald Trump and asked Donald Trump to make him Attorney General so that he could declare that the election was not to be honored. That's the best way I can put it. And co-conspirator number 5 is attorney Kenneth Cheesebro. Now, co-conspirator number 6. This is where we left off. Number 6 is a little more difficult to identify. Co-conspirator number 6 is identified in the, or described in this indictment as a political consultant who helped implement a plan to submit fraudulent slates of presidential electors to obstruct the certification proceeding. Now, there are some mainstream news outlets that have identified co-conspirator number 6 as being Jared Kushner, the son-in-law of the former president and the husband of his daughter, Ivanka Trump. However, I believe that co-conspirator number 6 might also be Steve Bannon or General Flynn. We don't know from the indictment. There's not enough description of co-conspirator number 6 to identify him. Now, why are these co-conspirators not particularly named? Because to name them would be to make them indicted conspirators. And I think it was absolutely brilliant of Jack Smith not to name the co-conspirators, because he has set it up for them to turn and become witnesses for the government. In that case, Donald Trump can hang it up. But we're going to take over now from where we left off. We're in paragraph 9, page 4 of this 49-page indictment. I'm going to summarize most of this part of it. The indictment said, no, and by the way, let's go back a step. Let me go back one more step. In the indictment, the grand jury specifically in the opening of the indictment found that Donald Trump lied about the election being stolen. So, in this official government document, there has been a grand jury that has determined that Donald Trump is lying about the indictment. He's lying about having, not the indictment, I'm sorry, about having won the election and the election being stolen from him. That is an out and out lie. So, and the grand jury has found that to be the case. And it is in his indictment that the grand jury made such a determination. All right, I'm on paragraph 9, and it is entitled The Federal Government Function. Paragraph 9 reads that the federal government function by which the results of the election for President of the United States are collected and counted and certified was established through the Constitution and the Electoral Count Act, a federal law enacted, now watch this everybody, in 1897. 1897. Donald Trump, this law has not been tested one time since 1897. That was before the turn of the 20th century. And now we've got at the time these overt acts occurred, a sitting president who has challenged the strength and the stability of democracy by abridging a law that was put in place in this nation in 1887. It further reads that the Constitution provided that individuals called electors select the president, and that each state determines for itself how to appoint the electors apportioned to it. Through state laws, each of the 50 states and the District of Columbia chose to select their electors based on the popular votes of their state. Now, what that means is that we have what we call the Electoral College. It's not a university or school. It's called a college because it's a gathering. It is a gathering of electors that are sent to Washington, D.C. to cast the votes of the people from their state. These electors are determined by the number of members of Congress that you have. So in the state of Tennessee, we have 9 congressional districts, so we would have 9 electoral college electors. And those electors, every state, according to the indictment, all the states, including Hawaii, Alaska, and the District of Columbia, have determined that their electors must represent the popular vote in their state. Let me say that again. If Donald Trump lost a state by one vote, then the electors must give their votes over to the Joe Biden. It's not stolen. But what Donald Trump did, according to this indictment, was try to get the electors to not go with the electors that have been chosen to go to Washington and cast those votes, but to supplant or substitute in fake electors who would go in and instead of casting the votes for Joe Biden in those states that Joe Biden won, they would cast their votes for Donald Trump, even though he did not win the state. That means he sought or he drew in. He sought and acted in such a way as to seek out people who would commit a crime on his behalf. That, my friends, is the classic definition of a conspiracy. That is the classic definition of a conspiracy. Let me read further. Through state laws, each of the 50 states and the District of Columbia chose to select their electors based on the popular vote in their state. After Election Day, the Electoral College Act, Electoral Count Act, required each state to formally determine or to ascertain the electors who would represent the state's voters. They don't represent themselves. They're not there to represent Donald Trump. They're there to cast the votes of the people of their state. Those people, hardworking, tax-paying people who went to the polls, who stood in lines, sometimes stood in rain and cold weather in order to cast their votes. And these people are to take those votes and to go to D.C. and to represent the voters of their state. Let me read further. It further reads, then on a date set by the Electoral Count Act, each state's ascertained electors were required to meet and collect the results of the presidential election. That is, to cast their electoral votes based upon their state's popular vote in the presidential election. I'm paraphrasing here without having to read this long indictment word for word. It further reads that that finally the Constitution and the Electoral Count Act require that on the 6th of January, now listen to this now, the Constitution of the United States and the written statutory law called the Electoral Count Act requires that on the 6th of January, following Election Day, whatever year it is, they've been doing it since how long? 1887. On the 6th of January following Election Day, the Congress was to meet in a joint session for a certification proceeding, presided over by the Vice President as President of the Senate. Now, I'm going to come back to that and explain that to you. To count the electoral votes, resolve any objections, and to announce the results. Thus, the Congress then certifies the winner of the presidential election as president-elect. Now, let me help you with this a little bit. So, in the Constitution of the United States, the Vice President not only serves as the first in succession in case the president is incapacitated or dies in office, But the vice president also serves as president of the Senate, of the United States Senate. What does that mean? That means that if there's a tie in the United States Senate, the vice president can break the tie. The vice president is a member of the United States Senate, as president of the Senate. Part of the vice president's duties is to conduct the count of the electoral votes and to oversee the certification of said votes in the United States Senate and in the joint session of Congress. Now, this is where the indictment gets really good. Let me read this last sentence. The federal government function from point of ascertainment to the certification is foundational to the United States democratic process, and until 2021, it has operated in a peaceful and orderly manner, get this, for 130 years. For 130 years, we have not had a violent insurrection and any effort or attempt to overtake the electoral process in our democratic processes here in the United States of America. Until America elected this fool known as Donald J. Trump, we've not had a problem. There's always been a peaceful transition. Let me give you another example. In 2000, it was widely believed that Al Gore actually had won the election, and a recount was ordered down in Florida. Well, Al Gore, first the Supreme Court stepped up and said, okay, we're going to stop this recount. And Al Gore could have challenged that. But what Al Gore did was he didn't pull a Donald Trump. What Al Gore did was said, in order to save the nation, in order to prevent an uprising in this nation, he said, we are going to agree to stop the count. He backed out. He withdrew his challenge, and he sailed on off into the sunset. That is what a statesman looks like. That is what loving your nation, loving your country, and upholding the Constitution really looks like. It doesn't look like a guy standing at a microphone talking about, I want you to show up on January 6th, and we're going to challenge it, and it's going to be wild. Those are the statements of Donald Trump. But I digress. Let's read on in this indictment. I'm on page 5 of the indictment, paragraph 10. The indictment reads, the defendant's conspiracy to impair, obstruct, and defeat the federal government function through dishonesty, fraud, and deceit included the following manner and means. Subsection A, the defendant and co-conspirators used knowingly false claims of election fraud to get state legislators and election officials to subvert the legitimate election results and change the electoral votes for the defendant's opponent, Joseph R. Biden Jr. 2, electoral votes for the defendant, Donald J. Trump. That is, what that means simply is that through dishonesty, deceit, and conspiratorial behavior, Donald Trump and his 6 co-conspirators attempted to get state legislators to not send the electors to D.C. to cast the electoral votes for Biden, those that were for Biden, but to substitute them out with electors who would go to Washington and declare their votes for Donald Trump. Oh man, let's read on. That is, on the pretext of baseless fraud claims, the defendant pushed officials in certain states to ignore their popular vote, disenfranchise millions of voters, dismiss legitimate electors, and ultimately cause the ascertainment of and voting by illegitimate electors in favor of Donald J. Trump. The defendant and co-conspirators organized fraudulent slates of electors in several targeted states. Those states are Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, attempting to mimic the procedures that the legitimate electors were supposed to follow under the Constitution and other federal and state laws. This included causing the fraudulent electors to meet on the day appointed by the federal law on which legitimate electors were to gather and cast their votes. Cast fraudulent votes for the defendant and signed certificates falsely representing that they were the legitimate electors. Some fraudulent electors were tricked into participating based on the understanding that their votes would be used only if the defendant succeeded in an outcome determinative lawsuit in their state. Now watch this. The defendant filed over 60 lawsuits, all of them ruled against him. Even the judges that were appointed by Donald Trump ruled against him. Why? Because his claims were baseless. His claims were baseless. His claims were baseless. I'm going to go through the rest of these counts right quick. Paragraph C says that the defendant and co-conspirators attempted to use the power and authority of the Justice Department to conduct sham election crime investigations so that they could send a letter to the targeted states that falsely claimed that the Justice Department had identified significant concerns. This was co-conspirator, if I remember, number 4, Mr. Clark, Mr. Jeffrey Clark, Attorney Jeffrey Clark. This was his action. He came up with the idea, but this indictment says he was first approached by Donald Trump. He didn't approach Trump. Trump approached him. D, it says the defendant and co-conspirators attempted to enlist the vice president, Mr. Pence, use his ceremonial role at the January 6th certification proceeding to fraudulently alter the election process. In other words, they tried to get Vice President Pence to lie and to accept the votes and to certify the electoral votes of those fake electors. Paragraph E, excuse me. After it became public on the afternoon of January 6th that Vice President Pence would not fraudulently alter the election results, a large and angry crowd, including many individuals whom Donald Trump had deceived into believing that the vice president could and might change the election results, violently attacked the Capitol and halted the proceeding. As violence ensued, the defendant and co-conspirators, all 6 of them, exploited the disruption by redoubling their efforts to levy false claims of election fraud and convince members of Congress that further delay of the certification was justified. Donald Trump knew that he lost the election. Donald Trump knew that the votes were not his. Donald Trump knew that before Election Day. The polls told Donald Trump he was going to lose the election. His advisors told him that he would lose by as much as 10 points. That's a nice spread, 10 points. Donald Trump could not see, in his narcissistic way of thinking, in his selfish and self-defeating way of thinking, he could not take losing the election. He could not walk away like every other president, like George Bush Sr., like Jimmy Carter. He could not see himself walking away. So what Donald Trump did was decided to just tear everything up. Like a kid who doesn't like the fact that he doesn't get in the game. So what he does is takes the ball and goes home. Takes his ball and goes home. Now this next section is the most important part of this indictment. It talks about Donald Trump's knowledge that he was telling a lie about election fraud. It reads, paragraph 11, that the defendant and his co-conspirators and their agents made knowingly false claims that there had been fraud in the 2020 presidential election and that that fraud would affect the outcome of the election. These profiles, hold on, I think I missed that word. These prolific, thank you, lies about the election fraud included dozens of specific claims that there had been substantial fraud in certain states, such as large numbers of dead people voting, non-residents voting, non-citizens voting, or otherwise ineligible voters casting ballots, or that voting machines had changed the votes that were initially for Donald Trump and they had been changed to Joe Biden. It was a disregard and a deliberate disregard for the truth, according to the indictment. The indictment further states that the defendant's vice president, who personally stood to gain by remaining in office, told him that he had seen no evidence of any outcome determinative fraud. The senior leaders of the Justice Department appointed by Donald Trump and responsible for investigating credible allegations of election crimes told Donald J. Trump on multiple occasions that various allegations of fraud were unsupported, that there was absolutely zero basis to believe that what he was saying was in fact true. The Director of National Intelligence, the defendant's principal advisor on intelligence matters related to national security, disabused the defendant of the notion that the intelligence community's findings regarding foreign interference would change the outcome of the election. Now, I want to stop right there. In 2017, we found, and there were congressional findings, that Russia had interfered with the election in favor of Donald Trump. Donald Trump called it the Russia hoax. He called it a hoax because he knew that it was true. He knew that Russia and China had made efforts to assist in his winning. Yet, he called it a hoax. He called it preposterous. He called it crazy for anyone to think that the election process could be interfered with when he was determined to be the winner. But you didn't see Hillary Clinton running around trying to uproot the whole election process in her favor. She certainly had more connections in the DC circuit, in the social circles, and in the halls of power than Donald Trump had. But she moved forward with a peaceful transition. Barack Obama peacefully handed off the White House to Donald Trump and Melania Trump. So when they say that no one would have dared done this, and it's never been done since 1887, they mean it. In 130 years, no one, not a single individual, has ever challenged this process. Let me read this next part to you. It says that the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, whose existence the defendant signed into law to protect the nation's cybersecurity infrastructure from attack. That means that this agency was created by Donald Trump when he was president. That they joined an official multi-agency statement that there was no evidence of any wrongdoing, no evidence of any voting system being compromised, no evidence of machines changing votes from Donald J. Trump to Joseph Biden Jr. No evidence. Days later, after the CISA director, whom the defendant appointed, whom Donald Trump appointed, right? Days later, after this man announced publicly that, days later he announced publicly that the election security experts were in agreement that the claims of computer-based election fraud were unsubstantiated. And you know what happened after that? After he came forward and gave a statement based on professional investigative findings, Donald Trump fired him. That's in the indictment. Look at page 7 of this indictment. It's in the indictment under paragraph 11. It's in the indictment. Also in the indictment, it says senior White House attorneys selected by the defendant. That means selected by Donald Trump. His lawyers in the White House provided him candid advice. They informed Donald J. Trump that there was no evidence of outcome determinative election fraud and told him that his presidency would end on Inauguration Day. My God. Also says that senior staffers on the defendant's 2020 re-election campaign also told him, man, you're going to lose Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin. They told him that on November 7th. They told him that he stood a 5 to 10% chance of winning, meaning there was a 90 to 95% chance he would lose the election. His own campaign people told him that. His own White House staffers told him that before Election Day. So this was no surprise to Donald Trump. Donald Trump knew where he stood with the American voters. This whole farce of claiming the election was stolen, it's all about Donald Trump's ego. It's all about his wanting to hold on to power that does not belong to him and never did belong to him. You're only allowed to hold such power when the American people entrust that power in you by electing you. When they choose not to re-elect you, you go home peacefully. All right. I am going to kind of jump to the next section. And we talked about the conspirators. I went over with you the definition of conspiracy. A conspiracy is an act or a set of acts, overt acts, wherein there is an agreement by more than one actor, more than one conspirator to undertake or to engage in this criminal behavior. Now, it is required. You cannot be charged with conspiracy unless you do something in furtherance of the crime. In other words, if John Doe and Jane Doe agree to rob a bank, they have engaged in a conspiracy. But that's not enough. It's not enough to have the mind, the criminal mind. We call that in the law mens rea. But you must also have criminal behavior. You got to have an overt act. So you don't just have the intent. Intent's required. Intent without the behavior is no crime. The behavior without the criminal intent is no crime. You have to have both. And when you have both, you have a crime. And let me tell you something, my friends. This was a crime. Now, let's talk about Donald Trump's defenses for a second. And the only reason we know these defenses, he's not presented these defenses to a jury just yet. And as I told you earlier, a jury must find him guilty or not guilty beyond reasonable doubt and to a moral certainty, and it must be a unanimous vote. It cannot be one holdout. One holdout and we have a mistrial. I suspect that what Donald J. Trump and his lawyers will be doing is trying to identify somebody to hold out. They know they cannot win this case straight up. So let's talk about his defenses. Now, the two defenses that we know Trump has already begun to rely on are, one, that he has a constitutional First Amendment right to tell a lie, to speak lies to the American public. Well, he does have a right to speak lies to the American public. However, there's an old maxim in the law that says that, that right is not absolute. You cannot cry fire. You cannot shout fire in a crowded theater. You cannot, there are all kinds of laws in every state on inciting riots. You cannot tell people a lie to start a fight. You cannot tell someone that, make fraudulent misrepresentations to a police officer or to an investigating federal agent. You cannot lie in court. If you lie in court, you still got a First Amendment, but it doesn't protect you in lying in court. That's called perjury when you lie under oath. So what I'm getting at is this. That defense does not hold water. So now let's shift to his next defense. Now this defense, I believe, is it has some basis, it has some foundation, it has a small amount of strength, but and that is that he says, well, wait a minute, I relied on the advice of my lawyers. My lawyers told me that there was a fraud. My lawyers told me to go out there and speak to the public. My lawyers this, my lawyers that. But there is what we call a crime fraud exception to the attorney-client privilege. You cannot rely on the advice of counsel if it involves committing a crime. Now, this is where it gets brilliant. So when I told you earlier, up in the beginning of this indictment, that Jack Smith had brilliantly listed 6 co-defendants, he did so because as co-defendants, that means Donald Trump cannot say he relied on their advice. They're unindicted co-conspirators. And he cannot lean on their advice as a defense. Why? Because it falls square within the fraud crime exception to the privilege. You cannot do that. In fact, I suspect that those that do not cooperate, those lawyers are going to get indicted right along with Donald Trump. All right, my friends, I'm going to let this go right here. We have now taken a strong look at the indictment, the charges, the definitions that this former president faces today. And I suggest to you that you follow it closely. What happens in this particular trial, I know he's facing indictments in the state of New York. I know he's facing federal indictments, 34, 37 counts in Florida. And pretty soon, and we think before the end of this week is out, he will be facing state indictments in the state of Georgia as well, related to this indictment. But let me tell you something, and you can take this to the bank. Donald J. Trump would be the Antichrist or a miracle worker himself if he were to escape conviction on all these indictments and all these charges. Now, he did not escape liability in the civil case that the lady who accused him of rape, which was tried in May. He did not escape that liability. I don't think that he will escape the criminal liability as well. The civil liability is imposed upon him. The court ordered him to pay $5 million. So at this point in time, Donald Trump has hired lawyers, and it's time to bat him up. And as I told you in part 1 of this series, he does not have any obligation to put on a defense. He doesn't have to take the stand. He doesn't have to open his mouth. However, this guy, his ego will not allow him to do so. He can't sit quiet. He'll get on the stand because he thinks he's smarter than they are. And my friends, I will take off work. I will take a vacation. I'm going to throw a Donald Trump trial party if that man gets on the stand and Jack Smith, who he calls deranged, gets to cross-examine Donald Trump. If he cross-examines Donald Trump, it will have more viewers than the Super Bowl and the World Series put together. My friends, until next time, thank you for joining us here at the Bailey Report.